Good evening. On behalf of the Acton 250 Committee, it will be my pleasure in a few moments to introduce Acton resident and renowned sculptress Meredith Bergmann. I first realized that she now resides among us from a brief article in Action Unlimited about the Boston Women's Memorial on Commonwealth Avenue. What a perfect way to revisit and deepen our understanding from last year of the emergence of Phyllis Wheatley into the story of the 1770s. Let's return for a moment to the countdown to April 19th, 1775. For us, it is now March 1775, forgetting what we know will soon transpire, and remembering that Acton's 600+ residents live on the periphery of the British Empire and are now impacted by the wrath of the Crown responding to the destruction of the tea over a year ago. We are approaching the season of planting now and town meetings, but that traditional rite has been suspended, uniting the countryside in support of Boston, whose port is now closed. John L. Bell will return on March 31st to pick up the military side of the rural reaction. And Joel Boyd recently helped us to grasp the power of the weapons that were being amassed. Remember, links for past talks are available at Acton 250 Events website, along with future events. We have few students this evening as the snow days landed a test tomorrow, and they are a responsible group. So I feel more comfortable alerting the adults in the room that at exactly this time next week, Acton 250 will partner with Dirigible in Littleton to celebrate the return of the Isaac Davis Ale. All are welcome, and most likely some of Acton's Minutemen will return. As Bob Ferrara explained last week, introducing the panel discussion, the History Subcommittee has debated how and when best to showcase the thematic stories of the groups about which little was known and so little taught to previous generations. With new credible information obtained and speakers identified, February's focus on Black history and March's on women's history seemed the most logical time to pause our countdown and expand the lens across decades and centuries. Meredith's many installations epitomize attempts to express this fresh understanding. Our speakers have repeatedly shared how the digitization of sources, newspapers, diaries, and letters have helped them to better understand and explain the historic context experienced by that hierarchical and patriarchal society that we have now come to better understand. This evening, we focus on public art as conceived by Meredith, most of which are three-dimensional, approachable figures in public settings, whose rendition reflect her personal interpretation of the history we have been following. How does an artist distill complex themes into discrete symbols, poses, and expressions? Without further ado, let's see and hear how her craft addresses this challenge. When she is done speaking, we will have a short Q&A, and she has brought with her a book related to her work that she'll explain and will be available. May we hear a warm welcome for Meredith.
Thank you, Pam. Good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me and for coming out to hear me talk about sculpture. I did not begin as a sculptor of monuments. I went to art school thinking I would tell stories and illustrate things and create books and maybe be a graphic designer. I wasn't sure. But the school had a bronze foundry on the 4th floor, and I fell in love with sculpture because it was easy. I could make things out of soft wax and then have help casting them in bronze and chip them out of the mold and be holding something that would last 5,000 years. And that was the sculpture bug that bit me. And then I had to go and acquire the skills to make portraits and figures. Because when I went to art school in the 1970s, it was the heyday of conceptual art, and traditional skills were not the main focus of teaching. But I did absorb a couple of important concepts: that art should not merely be a commodity for wealthy people, that it should serve some kind of larger community and purpose and vision, and that it should be of its own time, but also of all times. And therefore, I seek inspiration from art history in everything I do, but I always try to give it my own twist. And I have won and executed a number of commissions, but I also make works that I want to make, and sometimes that is a portrait. In 2010, I wrote a fan letter to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and asked her to sit for a portrait for just 2 sittings, because I didn't want to interfere with her work. I included pictures of the Boston Women's Memorial and other work, and I told her why her example meant so much to me. She generously received me and my family in her chambers at the Supreme Court, cleared away one of her 2 desks for me to work on, showed me her various robes and collars, and gave my son a little booklet with the US Constitution, which she signed. Those 2 days, she didn't sit, she just kept working. But I was able to finish her portrait months later based on the 84 photographs my husband Michael took. I eventually presented her with a copy of her bust. I made the finished casts in white plaster because I wanted her portrait to evoke the marvelous historic portraits of our founding fathers, Washington, Franklin, and Jefferson, that were sculpted from life by the French sculptor Houdon in the 18th century. In 2020, I was commissioned to sculpt a new portrait of Justice Ginsburg for the New York State House in Albany, to be carved in sandstone and installed in the historic 1883 $1 million staircase. That was a lot of money in 1883. It's a beautiful, ornate, disorienting space full of portraits of famous men. This time I wanted to sculpt her in her prime, in a more idealized way, befitting the notorious RBG, the symbolic figure she had become. I wanted to sculpt her wearing her famous descent collar, and this was my initial sketch. But her family preferred the collar she wore for special events, so I changed that. I made a plaster model and painted it to match the sandstone of the staircase, brought it to Albany. Fortunately, the sandstone used in the construction is still being quarried in Scotland, and the New York State Office of General Services acquired some. After the model won approval, I worked with a young stone carver to copy it into the stone block. And it was installed in the wall, and there was a joyful unveiling with Governor Hochul in August of 2023. And my earlier portrait of Ginsburg is now in the collection of the Smithsonian Museum's National Portrait Gallery, and this winter they had it on display. In 2004, I was asked to sculpt a statue of Marian Anderson for a women's college in Spartanburg, South Carolina. I knew her story because when I was little, my parents had bought us the World Book Encyclopedia. I don't know if you remember that. It's long before the internet. And I looked up my birthday, which is what children do, and there, the night before I was born, it said that Marian Anderson broke the color barrier at the Metropolitan Opera. So I went to my parents and said, "What is this?" And that's how I began to learn about the civil rights movement and this amazing civil rights icon. She had a magnificent singing career in Europe in the 1930s. Arturo Toscanini, the famous conductor, said, "This is a voice heard once in a century." When she came back to the States, she traveled around with her Finnish accompanist. This was during World War II, and German prisoners of war who were being transported were fed in the train station cafes, but her accompanist would have to go in and buy her a sandwich at train stations, where she was not allowed to dine because of her race. In 1939, she was due to give a concert in Washington, D.C. in the largest concert hall, Constitution Hall, which was owned and operated by the Daughters of the American Revolution. Washington was then racially segregated, and the DAR denied Anderson the opportunity to sing there in spite of her fame. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was First Lady, was a member of the DAR and had a newspaper column in which she publicly resigned from the DAR, and then got the Department of the Interior to give Marian Anderson the steps of the Lincoln Memorial as her stage for an outdoor concert. 75,000 people heard her sing that day in person and on the radio. You can find newsreels online, and they're incredibly moving. And that began the usage of the National Mall as a place for massive public gatherings. That's why Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the same steps and spoke about justice and his dream, as many others have done since. Here, the challenge for me was to make her whole body her portrait, not just her head. I wanted to make her statue as sensuous as possible, to literally embody her beautiful, ecstatic voice. Last summer, I unveiled a sculpture of Frances Perkins in Ithaca, New York. Frances Perkins was the first female member of a United States presidential cabinet from 1933 to 1945, and later taught at Cornell University in Ithaca. But before that, she was a young social worker whose mother had told her that her face was too wide and she must always wear a big hat, which she did all her life. In 1911, when she was still quite young, she witnessed the horrific fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist factory in Manhattan, in which 146 people died, most of them jumping to their deaths because the factory owners had locked the doors to prevent workers from taking unauthorized breaks. She began dedicating all her energy, which was formidable, to improving the lives of workers. 22 years later, Franklin Delano Roosevelt asked her to become his Secretary of Labor to help him with the New Deal for American recovery from the Great Depression. She came to meet FDR with a list of all the programs she wanted enacted by his administration. Because my committee wanted her posed on a bench, I was able to combine her portrait with this bit of historical narrative. She's showing you the list. Only after FDR promised her that he would help her to enact her programs would she accept the cabinet post. You will recognize the list, but it was audacious in 1933. 40-hour work week, federal minimum wage, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, abolish child labor, federal employment insurance, and Social Security. Only national health insurance failed to become reality. She's famous for being the architect of the New Deal, creating the social safety net on which we all, to some extent, rely, and which is now being undermined by the current administration. Here's one of many photographs that show her serious, warm, matronly yet challenging intelligence. She's ready to listen with curiosity and empathy, which I tried to capture in her portrait. And here's her grandson, seeing her portrait for the first time at the unveiling. He said he recognized her and was happy. And I was enormously relieved that people felt that my statue evoked such a complex and brilliant historical woman. My Ithaca committee had commissioned a second figure portraying an important living woman on a bench for a site a few blocks away from Ms. Perkins. Lucy J. Brown was a tireless local hero who co-founded Ithaca Neighborhood Housing Services, encouraging people to get loans and buy houses rather than rent. And she was a member of many civic organizations and a constant presence in her neighborhood. I worked from photographs of Miss Lucy in her prime, as she was then very old, ill, and living far away. Unlike Miss Perkins, she was usually casually dressed, her pockets stuffed with pieces of paper. She never sat down, people told me. And of course, I was supposed to sculpt her on a bench. So I sculpted her listening to you and taking notes, but she's sitting on the edge of the bench and is poised, just about to spring back into action. Miss Lucy was able to attend the unveiling and a huge neighborhood celebration of her life's work. Someone sang the hymn about "Give me my flowers while I yet live," and we did. Monuments and memorials are often highly symbolic and employ ancient symbols like the obelisk across the street from us, erected in 1851, using a shape first used to commemorate a great person in ancient Egypt 4,000 years ago. Monuments often employ allegory, in which symbolic figures are sculpted to embody truths or ideals like the Statue of Liberty. Historically, these are fictional figures, goddesses or nymphs, or an idealized young woman with a blindfold as an allegory of justice. But portraits and statues of specific real people can also serve as allegories to tell us a larger story. For the Boston Women's Memorial, the committee chose Lucy Stone, Abigail Adams, and Phyllis Wheatley to represent all Massachusetts women for their impact on society through their writing. How could I show the scope of women's achievements using only 3 women, no matter how accomplished they were? I realized I had to make the statues both portraits and symbols. Commonwealth Avenue Mall in Boston stretches west through Back Bay with a statue of a man on every block except this one. To win the commission in 1998, my first big break, I had to come up with a design that was in harmony with this beautiful historic street and at the same time was a work of contemporary art. In the 19th century, when Comm Ave was built, women were considered the angel in the house and to be put on a pedestal. These were phrases from the literature of the time. Here is a popular sculpture of a domestic scene from the 19th century by John Rogers, showing the ideal young mother with her child, looking on but not participating in the serious business of a game of checkers. Women were both worshipped and kept out of public life. We were not allowed to speak in public, and it was a long time before we won the right to vote. I used the vocabulary of the monuments to men along Comm Ave, a bronze portrait statue, a tall granite pedestal, inspiring inscriptions, but I got the idea of making a feminist metaphor real and concrete. I would bring the women literally down from their pedestals. I would subvert a prevalent kind of 19th century symbolism and bring it into the 21st century. And I would show the 3 women at work and at 3 different ages. I designed the circular shape of the memorial to encompass the span of a woman's life. As each woman used her skill in writing for a different aim, I would realize that each one could represent a different creative temperament, active, contemplative, and imaginative. In order to create a historical portrait, one without a living sitter, one must give oneself permission to identify with the subject, however grand or great. It was in order to make this project that I began to study history and discovered how inspiring real lives are. History wasn't something I had focused on before. I was in my early 40s, and I was old enough to begin to feel, as I read and researched images, that 100 years or 150 years is not a long time in human history. I was able to imagine my way into these long ago lives. Now, because I want to show a few more projects after this one, I'm going to focus just on Phyllis Wheatley. I researched her by reading every book I could find about her and reading her poems closely, and then the poetry on which she modeled her work. Phyllis reintroduced me to the pleasure of studying poetry, and I became a serious poet, and many of my poems have been published. Phyllis Wheatley was kidnapped from West Africa and brought to Boston in 1761. She was bought as a slave by the Wheatley family, who named her after the slave ship she arrived on, the Phyllis. And knowing how she got her name always makes me shiver. Recently, it has become more the custom to call her Phyllis Wheatley Peters, adding her husband's name to the name of the ship and the name of the family that owned her. She married John Peters after the Wheatleys manumitted her, but that was after the time at which I portrayed her in the memorial, so I still think of her as Phyllis Wheatley. Growing up as the Wheatleys' slave, Phyllis learned to speak and read English, then Latin and Greek, and began to write poetry so quickly that the Wheatleys gave her light household duties and let her study. Poetry was considered extremely elevated intellectually and spiritually, and she became famous as living proof that it was not only white people who had the brain, spirit, and soul to write poetry. The Wheatleys brought her around the town of Boston to every great family to recite her poetry, including, and this is a scene that haunts me, the Finch family, owners of the ship, the Phyllis. This is the only image we have of Phyllis Wheatley, an engraving for the frontispiece of her book, which was published in England because no one in Boston would print it. It felt essential to me to literally round out the engraving of Phyllis from her book, because that was her way of sending her image out into the world. But she's drawn here in profile, and that's just not enough information for a full round sculpture. I knew I would have to find models. And here is one of my models, Lita Riddoch, visiting the statue on its 10th anniversary. Whoops. Nope, I'm sorry. I designed her statue's pose with a twist so that she could sit alongside her pedestal and use it as a desk. It's a solid block of stone, so she couldn't swing her legs under it. I tried to sculpt the tension between inspiration and concentration, and to give her pose the spiral energy of a flower bud unfurling to the light. And here is one of my models, Lita Riddoch, visiting the statue on its 10th anniversary. By the time I was done, I'd asked 9 different women to pose for me. One was an extremely dignified cellist. One was a young woman whose ancestors came from the part of Africa from which Phyllis Wheatley was probably kidnapped. Each of my models related to the story of Phyllis Wheatley in a different way, enriching my sense of the potential power of her representation and of what the Women's Memorial could mean to different people. For me, Phyllis Wheatley represents creativity, the imaginative temperament. She represents a profound inner freedom and sense of self-worth, qualities I tried and try to identify with. The quotation on the front of her pedestal is from her poem On Imagination. Phyllis Wheatley wrote of being made to write by her own intrinsic ardor. She's looking inward, listening to her muse, as poets do, imagining the freedom of, in her words, the unbounded soul. The Wheatley family did eventually end her enslavement. Unfortunately, she died at the age of 31 in extreme poverty. No one knows where she's buried, and we're still looking for the manuscript of her second book. Occasionally, poems are found. It's quite tragic. But because she died young, she became the young, beautiful one in my composition. The memorial has become very well loved, and you can climb on it and pose with it. After the 2016 election, people put their "I voted" stickers on the women's statues, and someone left a note of apology in Lucy Stone's hand. The inscribed quotation reads, "Let woman's sphere be bounded only by her capacity." This was from Lucy Stone's speech at the Women's Rights Convention in Worcester in the 1870s. And the note said, "I'm sorry, we tried." In 2009, I was contacted by a group from Roosevelt Island, New York, which is an island in the East River separating Manhattan and Queens. This was a place traditionally of quarantine, isolation, and punishment, where you would take people with smallpox, tuberculosis, or mental illness. There was a large penitentiary. Then, after years, when the lunatic asylum was turned into a nursing school, it became Welfare Island. And it was renamed Roosevelt Island in the 70s when New York State built low and middle income housing. And it became residential, a kind of small town. There were still 2 big state hospitals there, built in the 1930s for people who were chronically disabled, including victims of polio. The whole island is graded for wheelchairs for easy access. And when the new housing was built, apartments were designed for the disabled with light switches at the right height and stoves that you could swing up next to in a wheelchair. This is long before the ADA, so this was a daring thing. The idea was to move severely disabled people into these apartments where they could live independently with an aide and be mainstreamed into the community. And the hospital staff were severely divided. Half of them said, they will die, and the other half said, no, they will live. On my committee was a witty and opinionated woman in her 70s suffering from post-polio syndrome, who rode around in a motorized wheelchair with a little portable box, which was her respirator. She remembered being a child in an iron lung like this boy, which forced her to learn to breathe again. Because she had an apartment, she was able to marry, have a career, get divorced, and live a full life. So this is a place that, for my family, has tremendous meaning. We have an adult son, Dan, who's here tonight, with severe autism, and he lives with us. But the idea that he could one day live independently with some kind of an aide and in a community like this that is so supportive and inclusive is visionary. There was already an FDR memorial at the tip of Roosevelt Island. It's glorious. It cost $50 million. It was designed by Louis Kahn, a world-famous architect. He had died suddenly in the 1970s, and the project was stopped, but revived again in the 1990s. And when it was brought as a proposal to the various community boards, local residents, including the Roosevelt Island Disabled Commission, said, where is our disabled hero who became governor of New York in a wheelchair and then was president for 4 administrations? And looking at this sculpture, they said, where is Roosevelt below the neck? And they were granted this little cul-de-sac on the left, en route to the Grand Memorial. The Roosevelt Island Disabled Commission wanted me to sculpt a statue of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt as their disabled hero interacting with a disabled child as an FDR Hope Memorial. This was the photo they showed me. It's a pretty awkwardly posed group. I particularly love the expression of the child in the center. Now, public art gives a voice to something that a community wants to express. They may have a very clear idea, like choosing 3 women to represent all women, or they may have no idea, but they want something represented, often passionately, and you have to find the best artistic expression for that. And my job as a public artist is to keep it a work of art and not let it become a work by committee. So I searched through the many, many wonderful photos of FDR greeting children who were fellow polios, as they called themselves. Look at the joy and recognition here on both faces. I wanted to show the strength and perseverance of these children, and I began to think of the child as hope. I posed a girl and President Roosevelt meeting on an oval the size of the Oval Office because children would often come visit him in the White House. He is turning to greet her, and they're about to shake hands. Roosevelt famously loved to shake hands with his public. Here again, I could make a monument to a great historical figure interactive. You can step in, put your child on his lap, shake his hand, and talk to him. Sculpting a portrait of someone so very famous, so often depicted, was very challenging. I had to find my own Roosevelt, one for whom every grin was an act of faith and a defiance of pain. I also wanted again to add a hint of allegory. I kept thinking of hope as a figure with wings. So I sculpted the corner of the girl's sailor collar to lift up as if it were catching the wind, so that in spite of her leg brace and her crutches, she might suggest a classical winged figure with fluttering garments. Here the commission also asked me to find a way to make a complex historical narrative part of the memorial. As you approach the sculpture, the pavement is inlaid with a timeline that you walk or roll up that tells the history of Roosevelt Island, the history of polio in America, and how most of its victims were children, and the story of FDR contracting polio as a 39-year-old man, and his contributions to inventing treatments and therapies and to destigmatizing the disease. And the grade, the guide path, and the benches are all specially designed to help people with different abilities to enjoy visiting the monument. And you can shake Hope's hand as well. Historical narrative became a major concern with my Women's Monument for Central Park. 20 years after I'd begun work on the Boston Women's Memorial, New York City began to catch up to Boston. Central Park had many statues of great men and none, zero, of historical women. The Central Park Mall, like Comm Ave, was built as a promenade, and this section was called Literary Walk. This is living architecture. It's like a cathedral. You look down the mall through arching elm trees in rows like columns, and the statues are in pairs tucked between the trees, as if into chapels. Further down on the right was a single statue of the poet Fitzgreen Halleck. When this statue was unveiled, 10,000 people came to the ceremony, and President Garfield unveiled it. But almost no one reads his poetry anymore. Across from him, there was an empty space. So that's what Monumental Women, a nonprofit, all-volunteer group of women from the New York area, decided they were going to aim for. But when they met with city agencies, they were told, oh, no, you don't want a statue. You want a garden, a nice garden. How about in Queens? And things like that. It's true. They kept saying no, and they kept persisting, and only after 4 years were granted this site. Monumental Women chose 3 women to be commemorated: Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Sojourner Truth. At least for this women's memorial, the 3 women had actually met and worked together, so I could sculpt them interacting in a real, not imaginary way. To make long-dead people live in sculpture, I researched not only their features, but also how they presented themselves to the public. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is no longer as famous as she was, or should be. She was the radical philosopher of the women's rights movement and a mother of 7 children. She had to stay home to raise them, but she wrote and wrote very intensely as a young and middle-aged mother. That was all the activism she could perform until she stopped childbearing and could go out and give her provocative speeches on her own. In these early photographs, she still appears as a proud mother. Stanton collaborated for many years with Susan B. Anthony, who most people can't imagine as a young woman because there's so many wonderful photos of her as an iconic elderly woman. Here, she's left behind her family's Quaker simplicity and has on a lace collar and jewelry because when she began to earn money as a schoolmistress, she got out in the world. But she was never confident of her own writing. She would write to Stanton and say, I have to go before the legislature, you have to help me with a speech. And Stanton would write back, if you will hold the baby and make the puddings, I will help. And Anthony visited regularly, and Stanton kept a room in her house for Anthony. Sojourner Truth was 20 years older than Anthony and had long been a popular speaker and advocate for abolition. She had walked away from slavery in upstate New York and come to New York City, where she was involved in religious revivalism and social work and then began to succeed as an orator. She made herself into an icon of self-ownership and self-definition by selling these cards at her talks, showing herself dressed as a proper middle-class woman and often displaying her knitting, which was not a hobby. Knitting, which was not taught to enslaved people, was a skill and a patriotic duty during the Civil War to knit for the soldiers. And so knitting became an important element in Sojourner Truth's self-presentation. I wanted to show these women discussing, debating, planning. This was something I'd thought of back in Boston from studying the statues of men on Comm Ave, standing in what I thought of as heroic idleness. They're up high, you admire them, but they're not actually doing anything. They're just symbolic of accomplishment. Here, I again combined portraiture with allegory to make each woman represent one aspect of activism: speaking, organizing, and writing. As part of the approvals process, I was required to consult historians who had written biographies of Sojourner Truth to prove that this meeting could plausibly have happened, that these three women could have sat around a table together. Actually, it was wonderful because I got to correspond with historians. One was an art historian whose graduate students got involved, and they said, oh, you have to include her knitting, and besides, the thread will make a wonderful graphic pattern on her skirt. Here I'm working with my assistant, Patrick Piggott, a sculptor of monuments and statues in his own right, putting finishing touches on the back of Sojourner Truth's shawl and the underside of Elizabeth Stanton's dress. Once I finish a monument in clay and win approval from the group that commissioned me, molds are made from these clay figures, and the molds go to the foundry. Bronze casting is done in sections and welded together. This photo shows a few of the many people who worked on this monument at the bronze foundry. This was the last day before it was to be hoisted onto a truck to go to Central Park, and people are still swarming all over this thing. On the right, Elizabeth Cady Stanton has her final coat of wax on already, but they're still sealing up the bottom of the Sojourner Truth figure. And then the 7,000-pound sculpture was delivered. It was unveiled on August 26, 2020, the anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. We were not allowed to have a big ceremony because of the pandemic. No 10,000 people, no president. We were allowed 75 people, and we had to call it a press conference. Nevertheless, it was a very festive day, and Hillary Clinton gave a lovely speech. I love narrative sculpture, sculpture in which things happen and stories unfold. And when I was designing this, I roamed all around New York City looking for other outdoor sculptures that had more than one figure in them physically interacting. Uptown, there's a monument with Washington and Lafayette shaking hands. That's it. With this narrative, I was careful to sculpt an almost ambiguous moment so that you have to decide for yourself what is going on. I'm going to show you some details that represent history. Sojourner Truth did lose part of her right index finger, that's not broken statuary, while she was enslaved in some kind of agricultural accident, and she was always very honest about how it was lost. But Susan Anthony used it in a speech as an example of the cruelty of Truth's master. Some things acquire a kind of historical legend whether or not they are true. I copied her carefully chosen clothing and added a pattern of laurel wreaths, a symbol of victory, to her jacket. I used my husband's grandmother's knitting needles, big wooden knitting needles from the 1950s, and I had to knit a little piece with very thick yarn and then shellac it and embed clay in it to make the soft yarn translate into bronze. But I had to look at YouTube for how to cast off my knitting because I could not remember. My Girl Scout merit badge will be revoked. Susan Anthony is wearing a brooch with an image of Minerva, the Roman goddess of strategy and war and wisdom, all of which suited her as an activist. And the paper that she is showing them is inscribed, "Votes for Women." There are similar pamphlets in her traveling bag. That traveling bag, her alligator bag, was so famous that there was a children's nursery rhyme for skipping rope, all about a baby, but it ends, "Mumps," said the doctor, "measles," said the nurse, "votes," said the lady with the alligator purse. Here it holds pamphlets for a free lecture by Sojourner Truth, a petition to the New York State Legislature, and a women's rights convention at the Great Hall of Cooper Union, all as if bursting unstoppably out of her bag. Stanton is wearing a sunflower brooch and has little radiant sunflowers on her dress. When she was a girl, she wrote a letter to the local newspaper and ended up writing a column. And because her parents would not have approved, she used the pseudonym Sunflower. Sunflowers later became an emblem of the suffrage movement, so it was right to include them. She has very big books under her chair because when she was a child, she remembered a widow coming to her father, who was a judge, and desperately begging him for advice because widows could not automatically inherit their husband's property. And the property was all going to her husband's brother, including her children and everything she owned. And she would become a dependent of her husband's brother if he would allow that. This was New York state law. Elizabeth was incensed and demanded to know why, and her father said, "It's the law." And she said, "I'll take my scissors and I'll cut it out of the law books." And he had to explain to her that this would not quite work, but that was part of her early radicalization. I included the Declaration of Sentiments, where in 1848, she rewrote the Declaration of Independence to say all men and women are created equal. The three big books, by the way, are by foremothers of the women's rights movements. I hope you will all have read Mary Wollstonecraft's 1793, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, Sarah Grimke's 1838, Letters on the Equality of the Sexes, and Margaret Fuller's 1845, Woman in the 19th Century. This gives you a sense of the scale of the monument in the park. I love the way the skirt, the shawl, and the tilting books echo the root flare on the elm tree. The monument was immediately put to use. Several weeks after the unveiling, Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and it became a spontaneous memorial to her with photos and banners and flowers. And then right before the next big election, somebody did this to it, which lasted, I think, about 3 hours before the Parks Department took it down. It says, "Put on your big girl panties and vote, and grab your future by the ballots." And that spirit of playful activism brings us to Lexington, Massachusetts. The Lexington Battle Green has several prominent monuments, and most of them are to men who died on April 19th, 1775, in the first battle of the American Revolution. They are all monuments to men. A group called Lex See Her was formed to recognize and honor women's economic, political, intellectual, social, and cultural contributions to their community and our country. And they staged several events each year. They decided they wanted a permanent memorial monument in a prominent place in the town near the town's iconic Minuteman statue. Which you can see off to the left there. As with Monumental Women and Central Park, they had to fight for their idea and their site, but after several open town meetings and select board meetings and presentations to various committees, they got their site on the green in front of the visitor center. Their initial call for proposals was a great compliment to me. They wanted 3 statues of women to represent all women of Lexington, and as examples of what they were looking for, the pictures they put on their website to illustrate that idea were the Boston Women's Memorial and my Central Park Monument. But they added a new idea, which I liked very much, a 4th pedestal that a visitor could stand on so she too could feel recognized. I was proud of the effect my work was having, but I felt strongly that if I entered the competition, it would have to be with a new idea. It's a risk when you enter a competition to ignore what the commissioning group says they want, and I did want to do the job. The more so since we had just moved to Acton and Lexington is so nearby. And I wanted to incorporate all of the above, historical narrative, portraiture, and allegory. And I wanted to have fun. The Central Park Commission had been an important and massive and challenging work, and kind of solemn. I wanted to make a joyful monument to women's achievements. Because I am an artist, a vital part of my work is asking myself what I want to do. First and foremost, I wanted to actually portray more than 3 women. All great social progress is made by groups, not single people, no matter how great. I wanted to include as much of Lexington's history as possible, including recent history, as in the Women's March of 2017. There was an exciting exhibition at the Buckman Tavern next to the proposed site called Bold Women of Lexington, and I was inspired to include many figures from that in my design, ranging from the 18th century to the present. Lexington is especially proud of its historic activism against British taxes, like the spinning protest of 1769. I wanted to design something emblematic and celebratory. Thinking, as I always do, of historic precedents, I thought of a freestanding arch like a triumphal arch. But while I felt it had to be strong and bold, I wanted it to land lightly on its site, to complement all the other sculptures and monuments surrounding it, very much the way strong female leaders who are praised for knowing how to listen or to play well with others behave. Now, I've always loved these gates. They're on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, just north of the Metropolitan Museum, at a playground. They're by Paul Manship from 1952. Manship, who had a studio on Cape Ann, is most famous for the Prometheus, the big gilded flying figure in Rockefeller Center over the skating rink. His gates are two-sided bas-relief sculptures, that's low relief. So everything is somewhat flattened, but you can still pat the animals. They're absolutely charming and beautifully sculpted. And they illustrate scenes from Aesop's fables, moral tales. And since the stories of historical women also contain lessons for us, I decided to design a freestanding bas-relief gateway. But I needed to find a way to organize in 2 dimensions all the figures I wanted to include across that gateway. I looked around. This is the sculpture that most people associate with Lexington, Massachusetts, the Minuteman. It's supposed to be Captain Parker, who was actually a stout, sickly, middle-aged man. This is a beautiful hunk. But I'm showing you the back of it because he's wearing a powder horn. And here's another monument to Captain Parker with a powder horn, a musket. So I took the graphic shape, the outline of the powder horn, for my organizing shape, because I imagined that women may have mixed the gunpowder or loaded the horns. They were not uninvolved in the American Revolution. They knew how to load muskets. And there is something explosive about the energy of the women's rights movement. I proposed, and this was my small competition model, 10 or 12 women from Lexington history marching down towards the center along the shapes of powder horns, towards a gateway that you could stand in the middle of, reach out and touch their hands, and that way become part of the sweep of history. The committee chose my design and then said, oh no, don't make it 8 feet high, make it 10 feet high. And then they asked, and could you give us different women on the back? Could we have that? I thought that would be a really interesting challenge to sculpt different figures fitting into each other's silhouettes back to back. So the design grew to 24 figures plus symbolic plants and animals, which represent more women and groups, but it also gave me a chance to pay homage to the Aesop's Fables gates that I loved in New York. We staged what I like to call a sculpture rehearsal on the site with a flat painted cutout in a wood frame and a parachute spread out for the pavement. I like to get a mock-up out on the site and see the scale, and it gives the committee a real charge because they get to see something vaguely resembling what will be there in situ. Among many things I saw that I wanted to adjust that day was the semicircular arch at the top. I tried drawing 16 different versions before I got one I liked. And the final version commemorates the Lexington women's 1769 spinning protest with a wheel. Sculpting the monument began with full-size drawings, which we transferred to plywood and made a cutout. Then clay was gradually built up on each side, and soon we were able to work on the entire composition. Lexiher members got excited about contributing the historical research, particularly for Margaret Tulip, who is one of the 4 largest figures surrounding the central doorway. Margaret Tulip was enslaved in Lexington in the 1700s, but when she reached a certain age, she became free, and then the nephew of the man who had owned her re-enslaved her illegally, and she went to court for years and won her freedom in 1770. Lexiher, and I have to thank Leslie Masson, who is here, found her living descendants many generations later. I don't think they even knew that they were related to Margaret Tulip. They came to my studio and saw the finished clay relief. I would have liked to have one of them model for her figure in the sculpture, but it was already finished. My model was Amelia Worthy, a Lexington resident, who wore a recreation of colonial dress hand-sewn for her by Lexiher members. But Tulip's descendant, Carol Goldsberry Tucker, asked if I could resculpt the extended hand to resemble her daughter's hand, which I was delighted to do. So here is Margaret Tulip in bronze, happy to be displaying the document that asserts her freedom. And I did resculpt her hand. I even copied the lifelines on her descendant's palms, so when you reach out to take her hand, you're touching the bloodline of Margaret Tulip. The Lexington Girl Scouts, who helped raise money for the sculpture, came to my studio to see it. They had also created banners throughout the town with silhouettes of notable local women, posed for by the girls themselves in historical costume. Then the wood and clay panels were trucked to the foundry in Amesbury, where Sincere Metalworks made 105 separate molds. They cast 105 separate wax pieces, which I then worked on for several more weeks, perfecting the details, and cast them using the lost wax process into bronze. They welded the figures together back to back, and then assembled each panel of the sculpture like a giant, very heavy puzzle. Then the bronze was patinaed with torches, chemicals, and pigments, and waxed, and installed early in the morning in 3 sections. That night, Julie Rose, my lighting designer, brought her daughter with her for the final adjustment. And then Lex Seeher staged a very grand unveiling. This was a hell of a ceremony. It was wonderful. The monument boasts an aviator, an educator, a college graduate, a newspaper editor, a suffragist. There's a woman burning tea, which was done in Lexington before the Boston Tea Party. There's a woman spinning, because there was a spinning protest against British taxes on cloth. There's an enslaved mother whose child is about to be stolen from her. There's also a mother calling out to her son to go fight the British. There's an architect, a music teacher, and a famous astrophysicist. There's the first select person to be female with a microphone and a shovel, and then a town moderator back to back with her holding a gavel. And then there's a few figures that are not specific people from history, but represent important things that happened. So there's a range of people, some of whom have gone down in history, and other people who are lesser known. Here to the left of the woman burning tea is Abigail Harrington with one of her children, calling out before dawn on April 19, 1775, to her teenage son, Jonathan, who was the fifer for the Minutemen, to wake up because the British were coming, and she urged, quote, "Something must be done," unquote. Her cry echoed down the years from 1775 to 1887, when Lexington women sewed a banner for a women's suffrage fair in Boston to raise money for the movement demanding the right to vote. Their silk banner carried her words, "Something must be done." That banner was, in turn, given to women from Massachusetts in 1913 to carry in the first ever large organized march on Washington, a march for women's suffrage. Here's how history also connects from this side of the monument through to the other. The elderly lady who in her youth sewed the suffrage banner, Caroline Wellington, marches along back to back on the other side with a symbolic young protester wearing a pussy hat and carrying a persist sign. So the energy connects from 1775 to 1887 to 1913 to the present day. Demands to have a voice and a vote, to be recognized as a citizen and an equal human being, are ongoing. History is being made now. That's why I titled the sculpture, "Something is Being Done." Some of the many ethnic groups in Lexington are represented by symbolic animals. This sculpture was made in the year of the rabbit. Some animals, like the squirrel, are just for fun, and there's a spider for spinning, a snail for the slow progress of women's rights, and the Massachusetts state insect, a ladybug. And here's the inscription on the central disc, right in the middle of the gateway. "Bold Women Make History," recognizes the exhibition from which I drew so much inspiration. And I will end with this, our seal. My husband, who is a writer and director, had parents who were immigrants from Europe. And he once said to me when we were very young, "I wish I had a seal, a historic family emblem." Then we went rowing in Maine, and one day a harbor seal started following us. So I thought, okay, I can make us a seal. This seal rises out of the waves and possesses the magical quality of calming the waters so much that it can carry a lighted candle on its nose. Our Latin motto means, may it move, may it teach, and may it delight. And that is what I've been trying to do. Thank you. Okay.
Take some questions?
Sure. Shall I stay here?
Yes, stay.
Okay.
So I had come hoping to understand better how you use symbols and poses and expressions, and I certainly learned. But I also learned of the evolution of narrative sculpture, a phrase that I was not familiar with. But then something else she said really clicked. Make sure I've got this correct. As a former history teacher and helping with this committee, I believe I heard you say that you became much more deeply interested in history in your 40s, all right? So whereas we're usually trying to inspire the 17-year-olds who come here, perhaps, who knows, we will never know, that someone will hear this and say, it's not too late for me to dig into all of this history that's being presented. And so let's see what their questions are. Bob Ferrara will be out with a microphone if it works. If not, we'll just go, right?
Great.
Oh, Bob Pine. There you go, Bob.
Thank you. On the FDR statue, one of the things that I thought was kind of ironic, and I don't know how you designed that, but there's a step going up to him. And when you're thinking of ADA and accessibility, did that play into your thought about how the statues and the structure took place?
Oh, yes. We worked with the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities, and they were concerned that a blind person might stumble into this park and bang into the statues. And that is not a step, it's a little bump curb. And it's at a distance where if you roll up in a wheelchair, you can turn sideways and shake FDR's hand without encountering that curb. But it was all very carefully designed. It does look a little strange, but
And
that's what it's for.
Franny.
Oh, yes, Michael.
I have the privilege of being...
My project manager and husband, Michael.
I have the privilege of being Meredith's project manager. I just wanted to say that it took months to work that out, and it was fascinating to watch a conflict between two kinds of disability, the blind and the people in the wheelchair. It was astonishing, but Meredith did manage to solve it.
Thank you. Yes.
I like hearing that story about not being interested in history till you're 40, because I fit that also. And it wasn't until I read the book by Jill Kerr Conway, The Road from Corraine, that I related to history for the first time. I had a question, because I once heard you speak in Boston, and you were talking about the size of sculptures, and you had a certain number, a ratio, a proportion, but of statues to real life.
Yes.
But that statue in Central Park looks really big.
It's huge, yes.
Does it not fit that normal rule, and why?
When you create a life-size figure, if you put it outdoors, it will look too small. It's like when you take your couch or your refrigerator, put them down at the curb. I don't know if they do that here in New England, but New York they do. To get rid of them, they're picked up. They look diminutive, and they loomed huge in your house. And it's the same thing with statuary. It just loses scale outdoors. So a life-size figure is usually 1.15, maybe even 1 1/4 times life size. And it's only when you get up to them that you realize their hands are larger, but from any distance. So the Central Park monument, some of that was pure defiance. Monumental women wanted it big, and they wanted it golden, and they wanted it, really in your face. And it had to be behind a fence, which made me very sad, but that was part of the historical design of the Central Park Mall. So they asked for the maximum size. So Susan B. Anthony is 9 feet tall. She's up on a 5-foot pedestal. So it's a 14-foot monument.
just curious, on the Lexington installation, how long from when you knew that you won that contest to when it was completed? It seems like a really long time.
Well, I think it was 2 years, was it, or 2.5? More than that, maybe 3 years. They generally take a minimum. The Central Park Monument was done in a terrible rush during COVID because of the deadline for the unveiling. That was 2 years, and that was crazy. I like to have 3 years because bronze casting takes 6 to 9 months. They have to take the whole thing apart, put it back together, take it apart again, it's very labor intensive. So
Wow.
several years is kind of, and I need time to sculpt carefully. I don't have a recipe. I'm always reinventing the wheel and trying to start from scratch. Okay.
Very fast question. What's next for you?
Okay. I'm working on a commission for Fitchburg, a kind of monument to a mentor. And I will show it to you when it's further along, but it's just in the early stages. And then I have some other things on the horizon. And
I want to ask Leslie a question.
yes.
How were you inspired to do what you did and track down the ancestors?
Because I'm a badger. So I started researching Margaret a few months after we decided to start the project. And I used to do my family history. And so, of course, I spent a lot of time on the Mormon site and stuff. And I knew she had children. I found her children, then her grandchildren, and then it stopped. And I knew that she had to have someone. I just felt like she had to have people still around. And so that brick wall was there for a long time. And then I got the bright idea of seeing who was looking for her son's wife. And that's where I found the link. And it was proved because they had, the Bible that Peter's wife had. And she had actually donated it to the Antiquarian Society in Worcester. The family was very prominent in the abolition movement and beyond. So it was quite the day when we found him. Yes. Well, I think what Meredith doesn't acknowledge is one reason it took so long is that because we wanted the monument to be next to the battle green, there was a tremendous amount of pushback. And and I have to say Meredith put up with a lot.
But then I was used to it. We were told it was not appropriate, that we should find, someone actually said, a less offensive site. This was said at a meeting. All the misogynist things that you would never think to hear.
Yeah.
So anyway, but it is, I think, very well loved now that it's up, which tends to happen.
And there was another scheduling disaster with that where because of the pandemic, the foundry told us that they were going to have to double the cost of the bronze casting. And that was the sort of, you either have to drop the price, and then we went around to other foundries and and the bids were all in the same area. So apparently the pandemic supply chain issues had a catastrophic effect on the price of bronze. But we did change foundries anyway in principle, and I'm much happier with
The one in Amesbury, yeah.
Yeah, then after the deadline, the 250th. So we could not install it this year. So we had to do it last year or wait another year from now.
And sometimes that kind of urgency helps with fundraising. I hope it, ease the pain a little.
Yeah, I'm very, very impressed by your work, and I see it working on two levels. One is actually as an art object. When you look at these sculptures, there's something that's intriguing and engaging, and you see, and it provokes a certain curiosity, so you want to know more, and you realize that that the pieces, especially when you have multiple figures, they're interacting with each other. But the other level is the actual narrative that we get to appreciate when you speak about it. And so as a comment, it's like, you know, I hope Michael makes lots of films about this and you give lots of talks, because it really enhances our appreciation of something that's already beautiful. But my question has to do with your relationship to the subjects themselves, because you do so much work that I'm interested to know, is it almost, do you feel like you actually know these people? I mean, by the end, and how does it feel when you finished? Is the conversation over for you then?
Great. I can't claim that I feel I actually know them, but I'm familiar with them in some way. I feel that I can take them as role models. I can be inspired by them. There's always huge mysteries, you know, as to huge sections of their personality that we'll never know. And we can never really know what it felt like to live in another era. Sometimes through literature, we can get a pretty good idea. But even what it smelled like, I mean, we just don't know what it was like to breathe that air. So I think I try to know them insofar as I can be inspired by them. One thing I wanted to say about your very kind comment about them as works of art is that I really think objects that are going to be out in public for a long time need to be beautiful and full of interpretation and full of thought, so they can act kind of like batteries, and people in the future can draw energy and ideas from them. And the more interpretations condensed into the, you know, whether they are successful or not, or whether they were accepted or rejected by the artist, the more work that went into them, the more they can provide. And that's why I don't like the new trend of scanning a living human being and having them milled in wax that can be cast in bronze. It looks great, it's totally realistic, every vein, but there's no interpretation, except insofar as the person is an actor and can personify something. But there's so many choices in making a sculpture that I think it's important to keep the human hand involved and definitely the human mind.
So if I may ask a favor of everyone, those of you who have come to other of our talks know that we usually gather the students with the speaker, and that serves the purpose of proving who was actually here, but it also shows to subsequent speakers that we do have a student turnout. Bob was thinking that we would turn this around. I mean, if people can become interested in history at the age of 40 and have this be the consequence, who knows how well we might be batteries. What an image. I don't think of yourself as a battery, but this is good. So if you're willing, if we could gather up here in the front, all of you, like the students, with our speaker.
Okay.
Come.
And I'll go back here and take...
And
We have press here this evening, and perhaps this picture would be interesting, helpful, Franny, right, for the Acton exchange. Oh, yeah. Okay.
We'll like it. And
This is my favorite
Oh, here it
talk
is.
by far.
oh, thank you.
I don't
Thank
need
you.
to stand next to you.
Okay. Yes, you can stand next to me. Great.
We should get Bill Flower here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Right here. Right here.
Yes, Bill, come.
So somebody perhaps in the back can guide us a little bit.
Hold on right here, Bill.
That's a good idea.
Okay.
We can't go
You
back
can scoot
much.
over.
Squeeze in.
Yep. Gotta stand up straight. Oh, I never say cheese.
Cheese.
I blinked. I blinked. Are my eyes open?
I couldn't tell.
I blinked. Okay.
We can open your eyes in Photoshop.
Good.
Right. Wow.
All right.
A wonderful job.
Thank you.
Isaac Davis, you know that. Acton. And back to your chair.
Oh, I will, yeah.
And there is a book for sale.
Thank you.
Question, who is the astrophysicist?
This-
Is a contemporary?